Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today is Friday, December 4th. Today is our 37th episode. Hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving. We're glad to be back with you. 3 shows until the holidays, and we'll just power through those and hopefully put an end to this year that's been so crazy for so many. Like we promised many weeks ago, we always start with the latest COVID news. There's not a lot to talk about today, except we want to touch on the charts that we've often showed you. Most of these from covidtracking.com, which has been a great asset, the COVID tracking project. There was a few weeks ago, where we were wondering if the hospitalizations in the US would pass the 2 previous humps, the Northeast hump and the South hump. But of course, they've gone way past since then. From the state of Michigan's perspective, the number of hospitalizations now exceeds those in the springtime, and that with the triaging that, for example, our friend Dr. Levy communicated to us happening across the region. The numbers do continue to go up. There might be some hope that we're peaking over the top here, but too early to tell in that regard. And as we've always liked to celebrate, even with the numbers, I think it's clear that our healthcare workers really do understand this disease better. So if there's one thing we can say, it's a great big thank you to them for the kind of work that they're doing. Dr. Philip Levy a few weeks ago was reminding us how now they don't treat the symptoms, they treat the things that are really likely to put you down, heart trouble and breathing and things like that. But they've learned to not treat the symptoms of COVID. So a fascinating insight from him. Go back and listen to that show if you haven't heard it. The statewide, we've heard about a number of hospitals in the state that have peaked and reached capacity. By region, it's not showing that, but we do understand that there are individual hospitals in that situation. And speaking of individual hospitals, we want to remind you of what our friend Jay Rajput from Beaumont told us a few weeks ago, that Beaumont has the AZD1222 COVID-19 vaccine clinical trial that they're just ramping up, and they are looking for volunteers. You can get to that at beaumont.org/COVID-trial. And the emails that he gave us last time we were together, you can use those as well to get in touch with them. I know Jay and others would love to hear from you if that is some interest that you have. So my first guest today is Rachel Rath from Johnson & Johnson JLABS. I want to welcome Rachel live to MedTech Crossroads. There she is. Rachel, how are you doing today?
Hi, Dean. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing really well. It's so good to see you again. I know
you and I met. You too.
I know you and I met back when you were with MDIC in the NEST program, working with FDA on real-world data. And now you're with Johnson & Johnson JLABS, but the director of the BARDA Alliance, which we want to hear about in just a minute, working on COVID projects with this program you guys call Blue Knight. So we're really excited to hear about that. But I want to start you here, Rachel. We always ask our guests on this, why are you crazy enough to be in this industry? We see people who have reached great positions like you have. You were working with Dr. Jeff Shuren on the real world data efforts at MDIC and NEST. You've seen a lot of this industry. Now you're at Johnson & Johnson, continuing to work on these partnerships, public-private partnerships. Why do you do it, Rachel? Why are you in this?
You know, it's a great question, and I love that you start with these sort of more personal stories a little bit, where we all bring our perspectives here. You know, for me, I grew up assuming I was going to be a doctor. I came from a family of doctors. I thought that if you wanted to work in healthcare, you became a doctor. I didn't really understand that there were other ways to do that. And there have been certain pivotal points in my, life and career and education and work after that have sort of led me here. So, there was a moment when I was on my way to becoming a doctor and realized, whoa, that one-on-one care was actually not where I wanted to be. And so making a shift from providing individual care into thinking about how do I combine other interests. So combining policy interests and healthcare into an MPH and policy, working with patient advocacy groups, in disease specific groups. And then, building from there, realizing I actually didn't just want to work with one individual disease group. I wanted to work cross disease. So going to work at PCORI, where I helped stand up PCORNet, their national infrastructure for comparative effectiveness research using a combination of clinical data research networks and patient research networks. And then realizing that it was, it's that love. I mean, you hit on it while introducing me. I like to help stand up partnerships. And I think that one of the things that's resonated with me over my career is we really all bring our own perspectives to this. And bringing together different stakeholders is so critical to us as an industry and being successful of pushing the status quo away from where we are today into those disruptive possibilities to be in a better position tomorrow. So what keeps me going is sort of bringing these different stakeholder groups together, combining different perspectives. I had the privilege of working at MGIC, helping launch Nest, as you mentioned, with real world data, and bringing together health systems and I would say industry. It was incredibly rewarding to see, the health systems know their data better than anyone else, but industry knows their devices better than anyone else. And what you can achieve when you bring those together and add in the patient voice and the clinicians who are using these products, it's really tremendous what we can achieve when we bring these different perspectives together. And that's really why I love working on partnerships. And now I'm at Johnson & Johnson with this new opportunity with BARDA. So it's those partnerships and stakeholder perspectives that keep me going.
That's awesome. I think that's one of the reasons you and I have resonated is because I once told a CEO, he was asking people what their interests were. And I said, I love the idea of putting people together into teams to do stuff. And I'm really hearing that resonance there with what you're saying. Now, of course, with the real world data, a lot of the interest there is it's so hard to look at devices and it's so hard to know have we gotten the right things. And I know some of the Nest activities we're looking at, well, let's aggregate that information. Let's know that these challenges and analysis are coming, and let's look at this data and find cool ways to collect it. And so in that sense, I think a lot of what, if I understand correctly, what you were doing at Nest, there are actually parallels to, for example, our startup friends who are approaching FDA and FDA is asking them questions and they have to go out and collect data on the spot to try to get their clearance. So I think it would be interesting as we transition, but before we go to the current role with Johnson & Johnson, in your experiences working with FDA and also working with some pretty large players in the industry and working at this nexus of, oh boy, how are we going to answer these questions and how does the data collection work for that? What wisdom do you have, whether we're talking to a large company, whether we're talking to the FDA, or whether we're talking to a startup? What are the pitfalls as those things come together? What do these people need to hear? Because you've been on the ground thinking about this.
One of the things that really resonated with me was at Nest, we were launching test cases and they're still ongoing. The results are coming in. It's exciting now sort of being on the outside to look and see how those projects are progressing, and they're doing a wonderful job reporting what they're learning. So I'd encourage everyone, frankly, to check that out. But one of the things that really resonated with me was I'm thinking about one project in particular where they'd had this really wonderful plan for how to capture the data on the devices in their health system. And then when they actually went to go do it, it didn't work. And, what I thought was so wonderful actually was there was enough trust in this multidisciplinary team that had been put together on the project that the health system partners, instead of being sort of shy or afraid to ask for help, they were willing to talk to the industry partner themselves and have that conversation just to pick up the phone and say, hey, we kind of got stuck. It didn't work. And the industry partner could just say, oh, we know exactly what you're talking about. Try this. This is how we would find the data. And just not, I don't know if I would call it, too prideful or just not being afraid to pick up the phone and have a conversation and having that trust. And I think it's really important to build those teams early on and the importance of co-development. So you can build that trust and build that communication, because frankly, what could have, I would say, stalled a a project for an extended period of time had this health system just said, oh, we'll try to figure it out. We're not going to have that open communication. Instead, they were willing to have a conversation, and it really was just a couple quick phone calls before they could troubleshoot it and be back on their way to success. So, not being afraid to have those open conversations with a broader team and building that trust in multidisciplinary teams was one of the things that just really resonated with me.
That's really cool, and the ability to have those communications. And again, before we go down to the BARDA Alliance, how would you compare and contrast an effort like Nest to the things that maybe a smaller startup would face? Is your perception that availability of communication and connection is something that's becoming increasingly available? Is this a unique thing that you've got to be at the top echelons to get? Do you have a this might just be a personal opinion at this point, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm sure it's a personal opinion, but I'd say NEST, the National Evaluation System for Health Technology Coordinating Center, is housed within the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. And both of them are really startups themselves. So, MDIC is a startup, Nest is sort of a startup within a startup. So many of those same challenges that startups face are faced by Nest and MDIC themselves. But, in terms of some of those challenges in communications, I'd say, first, Nest works with large industry. They also work with small startups, so smaller industry partners as well. So whatever size you are as a MedTech company, wherever you are in your sort of development timeline, they work with the large and the small partners. In terms of sort of connectedness, I think we're all so much more connected, frankly, in some ways today than we were a year ago. This program didn't exist a year ago, but what a tremendous opportunity you've created for the ecosystem to come together every week. Who knows what conference we would have bumped into each other at again today. So I think in some ways, we're almost more connected on an ongoing basis. And, everyone's connecting by Zoom. I'm working more, frankly, with colleagues around the world, I think, than I would have if I wasn't sitting home on Zoom, but, sitting in an office. So I think that small companies, big companies, everyone's converting or have converted at this point to working virtually. And there's just, I think people aren't afraid to pick up the phone, and responding to those sort of ad hoc requests and new introductions. And so I think it's a little bit more awkward personally, sending those cold call emails, but I'll say, I onboarded to Johnson & Johnson kind of just before flipping into the virtual world. And so frankly, I was sending a lot of emails within J&J to people who I didn't know saying, I just started, here's what I'm doing. Can we talk? I'm interested in what you do. And just having to send those sort of cold call emails nowadays versus bumping into each other at conferences, I think we just have to sort of get over our maybe fear or apprehension of doing that and bite the bullet.
I'm watching a number of us who were like reluctantly doing it at first, and now it's become sort of second nature, and it's good. Well, now you've been at J&J for the last year, 3 months there before COVID hit, and I think we'd like to get our audience to know about Johnson & Johnson Innovation, JLABS, and then we want to talk about this thing that you're running, the BARDA Alliance and the Blue Knight program, which sounds absolutely fascinating, especially as it relates to COVID. But tell us about J&J Innovation and JLABS.
Yeah, Jean, can I cheat and share a couple slides with the group here?
Cheat and share a couple slides. I'm going to make sure that's available. Now it's available.
All right. Let's see. Make sure I pick the right deck. Let's see. Is that working for you?
Yes, we've got it.
All right, great. So I'll give you a bit of a brief overview on Johnson & Johnson Innovation and JLABS, then we can dive into Blue Knight if that works for you, Gene.
Yep, that sounds great.
So Johnson & Johnson Innovation is really centered around the idea that the best innovation can come from everywhere. It's not just from within big companies and within our own walls at Johnson & Johnson, but Johnson & Johnson Innovation focuses on the idea of innovation is being created everywhere, and we want to help accelerate that wonderful innovation that's happening around the world. In cross sectors, so pharmaceuticals, consumer products, medical devices, across the board. I think for the audience today, we're probably more interested in some of those med device, med tech areas. But we do look across all sectors, and there are different pillars. And what I love about this show that you have on Fridays is that it's really conversational. So I'll just say there's sort of 4 branches, you could say, of Johnson & Johnson Innovation. Where I work is Johnson & Johnson Innovation JLABS, which is our network of life science incubators spread around the world. There are also 4 innovation centers located around the world. JJDC is then our venture fund, and then Janssen Business Development exists as well. Here's our global footprint. We are global. We're looking at innovation around the world, which is really exciting. And we're all a very interconnected network. So, I work a lot with the team in Australia, for example. I work a lot with the team in Belgium as well. But what JLABS and Johnson & Johnson Innovation are all about is trying to help small companies get big company benefits. So when you think about starting a startup, we want the scientists and the innovators to focus on that science and not sort of be burdened with the lab operations and setting up their business operations and their footprints. Where do you get a coffee maker to make coffee? Where do you have conferences? There's a cat hopping around in the background. We knew she'd come up at some point. And so JLABS facilities, of which there are 13 around the world, the newest one will open in 2021 in Washington, D.C., try to provide those core services to startups so that scientists can focus on their technologies and innovations and not on the lab operations and the business operations. So the incubators themselves have biology labs, chemistry labs, offices, conference rooms, shared facilities, kitchens. They're really beautiful, beautiful facilities. In addition to sort of that access to the JLAB space, first of all, I'll say it's a no strings attached model. So you come in, you keep all of your IP, you keep your innovations. That's incredibly important. We want that to stay with your company. Now, maybe we'll do a partnership somewhere along the line. Maybe we won't. There's no obligation there by any means. We also do a lot of educational programming. Every company that comes into JLABS also gets mentorship. There's an investor hub, there's resource hub. It's all about building connections, which, as we talked about earlier, is what I love to do. And so JLABS is really about building connections and helping startup companies accelerate even faster. So that's just a little bit about JLABS. And Blue Knight fits within that. And I joined Johnson & Johnson about a year ago in order to help launch this new collaboration between Johnson & Johnson and BARDA. So Gene, I don't know if you want me to hop in a little bit specifically on Blue Knight here, or if you have any questions.
I think we even saw some questions in the chat about, everyone wanted to get to, okay, what's the relationship here? We don't understand the relationship. So I think you're spot on. Yeah.
So Johnson & Johnson, right, we're a big industry group. And then BARDA, which is a division within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And BARDA's mission, we've all heard so much more about BARDA, I think, over the last year. They're doing such a tremendous job right now working on all of the COVID-19 response. BARDA is the division within HHS that's responsible for global health security for the U.S. So they look at threat preparedness for chemical, biological, nuclear, radiological health, emerging infectious diseases, and pandemic influenza. And so while JLABS looks at accelerating innovation around the world, BARDA is looking at those global threat preparedness solutions. And where we've come together to form Blue Knight is to say, what are those areas of interest for both? And how can the JLABS ecosystem help accelerate on strategy solutions so that we can all live in a more prepared world for these unknown and known global health threats? So working together between Johnson & Johnson and BARDA, we're looking at those areas of shared interest. So pandemic influenza, global health threats, and looking to incubate and accelerate companies that are on strategy. So we have sort of these tiers in the middle here. So what we're doing is we're providing residency opportunities at select JLABS locations for startups working in this space. So these companies come in, they become full JLABS companies, but they get some additional benefits and build those connections with BARDA. So by becoming a Blue Knight company within JLABS, you also get mentorship from BARDA. So in addition to that mentor that you get at Johnson & Johnson, who may be thinking about things from a commercial perspective, you get a mentor at BARDA who's thinking about things a little differently and helping build that connection into those preparedness solutions. And, you know, as we were talking about earlier, everyone has different perspectives and needs. So, and one of the things that's so important for BARDA when it comes to preparedness solutions is that technologies do have a dual use functionality. So if you're developing a technology that only has a preparedness solution, in an ideal world, frankly, we'd never need it because the threat would never come to fruition. So having those dual applications of a commercial application and a preparedness solution helps as well. And then we also do a lot of programming. We have a symposium coming up next week that I'll talk about in a minute so you can see some of what that programming looks like, trying to sort of amplify the conversations in these areas of interest between J&J. And so as I mentioned, we do programming, we do symposiums, we bring together sort of learning communities, and the idea is really to help these companies accelerate. To give you some examples, you mentioned that some of our companies are looking at COVID solutions. And so in August, we actually announced our first cohort of companies. So Blue Knight overall, I'll just say, is not just focused on COVID. We're really focused on what are those threats, both today that are known, but also the unknown of tomorrow. So when I'm talking to leaders, I always try to challenge them and say, you know, what's your wish list? What do you wish innovation looks like in this space? Think ahead 20 years, not where we are today, but where do you want to be? And then how do we work together to get there? But in August, we announced our first set of companies, which are based around the world at JLABS locations. And these are all companies that pivoted in response to COVID to help make an impact. And so it gives you a little bit of a sense of the range of technologies as well. Gabi Smart Care is a company, for example, based at JLABS in Beerse, Belgium, and they're actually developing a wearable sensor for pediatrics. So that's one type of solution. So that at-home monitoring of COVID symptoms, really important. So that's one example. Seven Hills Pharma is developing a solution, for example, to help amplify the impact of a vaccine. So to go with that vaccine and help, particularly for immune compromised individuals, to help increase the impact of the vaccine. So these companies are an example of companies we're bringing in. We actually also, since then, have brought in a company named MPod based in New York City that's developing an at-home diagnostics. So they've been part of the RADx program as well over the last 6 months or so. So we've got diagnostics, we've got wearables, we've got the therapeutics as well, but there's, it's a whole suite of technologies that have to work together to help make an impact when we're talking about a threat. And as I mentioned, you get access to JLABS, but a couple of these exciting pieces are traditionally companies actually they pay a license fee to come into JLABS and have access to the whole ecosystem. In the case of Blue Knight, that fee is actually supported by BARDA. So you get access into the JLABS ecosystem to become part of this cohort, and you use your financial resources to help drive forward that science and that innovation, and you're not spending that on access to JLABS. And we're currently accepting applications for sites in New York, Toronto, DC, San Diego, but then excitingly, I think, virtually as well. So not every company needs physical residency space, or not every company is located where there's a JLABS location. So we also accept Blue Knight companies virtually so that we can help bring the resources of Johnson & Johnson and BARDA to meet you where you are.
That's a pretty cool setup. And so you're actually dealing here not only with COVID solutions, but sort of emerging threat solutions in general as a part of Blue Knight. And then more specifically, or not more specifically, more generally with JLABS, companies that are doing cool cutting edge stuff. So it seems like there's a place for everybody in this if they end up getting involved. Yeah,
there really is. And then the other thing I would just say is, as you're saying, it's not just COVID solutions, but thinking about threat agnostic solutions as well. I think Gabi's a great example. They're monitoring oxygen levels, for example, that's not just related to COVID. That's where we look at like, what are those early detection capabilities? What are those early diagnostics? And can we develop diagnostics that are not just for COVID-19, but maybe for all coronaviruses? Or, a multiplex that looks at COVID and flu, for example. I saw a question come into the chat. I'm just going to jump in and answer it, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question about what for virtual companies, what's the benefits that JLABS brings? So I think there's definitely JLABS benefits virtually. So you become part of this whole ecosystem where we have, programming where we help highlight you. We have an investor hub where investors are specifically trying to build relationships with JLABS companies. We have a resource hub where you have access to service providers, for example, at sort of a reduced cost for having access to the whole JLABS community. Again, trying to give you sort of the bargaining power, so to speak, of what maybe a big company would have, where it's sort of cost shared across smaller companies. And if you're interested in hearing more, and then of course, I'd say the mentoring component as well. So all virtual companies will also have that Johnson & Johnson mentor if you're a part of JLABS, and we call them JPALs. And then if you're a Blue Knight company, you still have that mentorship from Johnson & Johnson and also from BARDA. And I'd say I am such a fan of the mentoring because it's really about helping the companies meet, whatever their needs are. If that mentor could be someone helping you look at your regulatory strategy, that mentor could be someone helping you advise on your website, or helping you with your pitch, or helping with your science. So that mentor really can vary based on the needs of the company, and frankly change with time as well. There's one mentor who I know often gets pulled in to help with sort of market strategies, entering a new market, looking at business plans, for example. So that mentorship is a huge component of it.
I guess we also have a question here. We also have a question here, and this was back on a specific company, so maybe a quick answer on it, but what does Rachel mean by increasing the impact of COVID-19 vaccine for immunocompromised patients or people? Are you saying give it to them earlier, faster, or find a personalized regime and cocktail? I think this was in reference to a specific company that you had there.
So there's actually a couple companies working on different ways to help amplify the impact of the vaccine. So there's one company, for example, that's looking actually at microbiome solutions. So which sort of, it's using your microbiome to help enhance the vaccine's impact by looking at positive impacts of the microbiome, and then how they can use that in conjunction with a vaccine to increase the immunoresponse to it. So helping sort of stimulate the immune system. There's a couple of technologies working on those types of therapeutic solutions.
Great. And I'll take this pause I think Rachel's got a couple more slides here, but I want to just take a minute and say, if you've got a question for Rachel, feel free to raise your hand in Zoom. You can either type it into chat or questions, or raise your hand and we'll bring you on live to ask it, but go ahead and do that when you get a minute. Back to you, Rachel.
Yeah, the only other couple slides I have that I did want to share with everyone, that's sort of logistical. I can cover this quickly. To become a Blue Knight company, if you're interested, first of all, obviously reach out to me, or I'm more than happy to talk to anyone. But it's a pretty simple application process. I just like to highlight here that I think the word application can scare people. You think of like large grant applications and how burdensome those are. And I always promise both our applicants and our individuals on the other end who review it, it doesn't look like a federal grant application. These are pretty streamlined applications. They're all non-confidential information. We're looking at, understanding a little bit about your science and technology, understanding if there's strategic alignment to J&J and BARDA. And while we're interested in every technology, we want to also make sure you're coming in and we can help support you. So, J&J's technology interests are, farm, med device, consumer. We do have pillars in each of those areas. And then looking, is this something novel? Is this something that's meeting a significant unmet need? And then, we do want to take a look at who the team is and the financial solvency. That's not to say any company needs to be at a certain degree of financial solvency. It's just something we like to have a conversation about. So we're all sort of having that transparent conversation again. But, they're quick and painless compared to, federal applications, I would say.
I think a lot of people just breathed a sigh of relief when they heard you say that. So it's probably a good step there.
I've reviewed and helped write many applications, and I will stand by that statement.
Yeah, there you go. You've known it yourself. We've got another question here. How far along does a medical device need to be in order to be considered by Blue Knight? Is there a minimum technology readiness level before applying?
It is a great question. And the short answer is there's no minimum. We like to see some level of data, just, it can be in vivo, it can be in vitro, it can be proof of concept, some early data, but there's no threshold of where you need to be. And I actually think this is something personally really exciting about Blue Knight, where, and I don't know if this company or other individuals on the line have applied to work with BARDA before, but BARDA's funding starts at higher levels of technology readiness. So their BARDA traditional funding mechanism, for example, you have to be around a TRL 5 or 6 usually to be eligible for those big BARDA dollars. And then even when you look at the easy BAA, you still have to have data and you're still farther along. And Blue Knight actually is an opportunity for those earlier stage companies that are still looking to get into clinical. So it's a window into earlier companies, I think, for BARDA, where we can then help accelerate them along to be ready for the easy BAA funding and for the BAA funding. So I would say wherever you are along your continuum of technology readiness, you're at the right spot.
Get in touch now and find out.
Yeah.
Great. We've got a question here from our friend Ken Spencer, who's with University of Michigan MCirc and a longtime listener of the show. Ken, do you have a quick question?
Yes. So, Rachel, a long time ago, there was a study, not so long ago, but a study done by venture capitalists on the West Coast there, looking at all the different incubator models that were around, and they identified a lot of issues around those incubators. And so one of the things we did at University of Michigan is to try and make sure we addressed all those things and created our own incubator environment out there. So with that, one of the real problems they had with incubators was that the clinicians weren't leaving their day job to go work inside the incubator, right, out there. So we've been able to create that environment where they don't have to do that, right? I mean, they work right inside Michigan Medicine out there. Mm-hmm. Given that, we've also come up with several COVID-19 innovations that we've already licensed to startups out in the industry, and we've just recently got an EUA on several of those things. So are they eligible to be a JPAL, the startup itself, or does it have to be a university?
Are they eligible to be a JPAL as in be a mentor or to become a JLABS company?
Well, I think their interest would be to engage with BARDA, to have some pathway to talk to BARDA about, what they already have developed and from our licenses and stuff like that, and have already received an EUA now. So they're fairly far along.
Yeah, so I'd say, honestly, I'm happy to talk to them and hear more sort of about maybe a case-by-case basis. If it's a technology that's been licensed to a startup or any company, in order to be part of JLABS, you do have to be a company, not an individual researcher. We don't care how big that company is. You can be a company of one, but because of the way our license agreements work, you do need to be a company. If you're looking to learn more about BARDA, I'm happy to have a conversation with them and sort of give some tips about some of those best ways to contact them. I would also say a lot of our educational programming provides opportunities to interact directly with BARDA and create that sort of two-way conversation between companies, researchers, and BARDA. So, the symposium, for example, that we have next week, there's many opportunities to interact with BARDA directly at that conference. And not just one example. We do programming on an ongoing basis, and usually BARDA is part of that, and you can help use those programs to build connections as well.
Great. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you, Ken. We appreciate that. There's another comment here. We are going to have to switch to our next segment in just a second here. So I want to make sure I give Rachel time to finish her slides because we keep peppering her with questions, which is phenomenal. We love it.
Questions is great.
I guess one quick question for you, Rachel. In terms of JLABS and getting involved, you said that BARDA takes care of, or at least helps with the fees for JLABS if you're a Blue Knight company. Just really briefly, how does that work if you're not a Blue Knight company and you want to be part of JLABS? What do people have to go through in terms of fees? You said they're not giving away their IP, they're not giving away their equity, but how does that work?
Yeah, so the license fee to be part of JLABS is really for access to the space. And so it's proportional to the amount of sort of footprint that you have at that site. So if you're looking for, maybe you're looking for a singular lab bank, maybe you're looking for renting a whole concept lab. So that it's not a flat fee. It depends on the size of the footprint within the JLABS location. So that's your license fee. And it varies a little bit by site and market. It also varies a little bit on the size of that space that's the right fit for your company. And we work with you during the application process so that you have access to the space that you need. If you don't need a chem lab, we don't want to give you a seat in a chem lab. We want to make sure you're getting the space that you need within the JLABS facility.
That's pretty cool. So you're charging people based on sort of a traditional here's space in a building kind of a thing, but the value add is all of the access and the mentoring and everything else.
Yeah. We think about it as sort of a license fee to access to the ecosystem, because as you're saying, Jean, we don't think of companies coming into JLABS as just a company. We think of them really as, coming into the JLABS family. I was on a call with a company the other day coming in, and it's a welcome to the family call. And we're really all here to help you and building connections globally as well for each of these companies.
Well, that's phenomenal. We do have a comment here from our friend Olaf, who mentions that Blue Knight and companies like Intubeing might provide useful input to a request for public comment. I'll actually make an email connection later on. It sounds like Olaf knows of a request for public comment that he thinks would be valuable for some of these folks to think about and look into. So I'll make a connection later on that. Rachel, any parting words for us? We really appreciate your being here today.
I would just say the only other thing I'd add, Jean, if you'll just indulge me, is we have the symposium coming up next week. It's a really exciting opportunity to build those connections with BARDA. There's visionary sessions, but there's also scientific discussions really diving into some of these topics, including having senior leadership from J&J and BARDA, along with, I would say on the diagnostics, we have a program specifically on diagnostics featuring Q and the CEO of Find. So that will really dive into where is the future of innovation in diagnostics going? What are we looking for? How can we really shift the status quo there? So that's just one example. We also have small group discussions looking at developing technologies for the end user. So I'd say registration is open. Registration it's free of charge, and we'd just love to have anyone from the MedTech ecosystem there. So feel free to reach out. Jean knows how to reach me.
That's awesome. Rachel Rath, Johnson & Johnson Innovation, JLABS partnership with BARDA. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
It's exciting to see what these kinds of partnerships are doing. I like that model where charging for space and then getting all the other stuff as just along with the package. Next up, I want to welcome our next guest. She's a longtime member of the Michigan MedTech community. Lindsay Klee is with us today. Lindsay, are you there?
I am. Hi, Jean. How are
Lindsay,
you?
It's good to see you.
To see you too.
I don't know if you're still getting any biking in these days, but it's the snow's coming down every now and then.
Yeah, it is coming down. It's looking melted now, but the cooler temps are hard. I have, for the first time this year, started to actually appreciate virtual riding.
Lindsay's a competitive cyclist, and she's a longtime member of this community. She's also a mentor for the Michigan SBDC, as well as running some efforts of her own. And Lindsay, thanks for coming on. We want to talk a little bit about SBDC today, the offerings that you're part of, and then one of the things that I think it's a little known gem in our community is your expertise with reimbursement and coding, which sadly, as we've talked about on the show before, is something that folks don't think about often until too late, and they discover there's nobody to pay for their medical devices and medical technologies. But like we always do with folks, I got to put you on the spot and ask you. I've known you for, I don't know how many years it's been. I don't even know if I want to think about how many years that we've both been known each other in this
At
industry.
least a decade.
At least a decade. It's been at least a
Mhm.
decade. Working on a lot of startups together in different contexts. And so I ask you the same question I asked Rachel, which is, what keeps you in this? What keeps you doing this? Startups are a hard business, especially in the med tech field. We all know that they have interesting life cycles, many challenges, many ways to fail. What keeps you doing this?
You know, I think the biggest reflection that 2020 has brought for me in terms of, you know, kind of career choice is really just being blessed to be part of this community here in Michigan, and to have, and there's a number of people, I was looking at the participant list who are on the line right now who've made a fundamental difference in this community and also in my career. But I think there's unity in that you don't find necessarily in other communities. And I'm just very much indebted. And I think continuing to kind of serve this ecosystem is important to me. The biggest driver from a passion standpoint has always been, how do we get new medical tech that is encouraging health, whether it's brain health or pediatric health or non-infection disease health, right, to the public faster and have a clinical impact. And that's really always been sort of a core driver for me.
That's huge. It's so good when you see these things finally getting there. Now, you've, in many different contexts and roles, you've helped startups at many points along that process. Now with Michigan Small Business Development Corporation, I think I got the name right there. We just all call it SBDC, on their tech team as an advisor, tech consultant advisor. Can you tell us, so we get the structure of this? I know we had Denise Graves from MEDC on a while ago, and she talked about MEDC more broadly and some of their stuff. And give us a better picture of SBDC and tech team and how this works in the community.
Sure. And I'm definitely not the expert on the overall overarching structure of the SBDC, but I can first kind of tell you where I sit and then what the interplay is. So I am part of the tech team. I'm the tech team's life science healthcare expert. And so for small business technology companies statewide, if they're doing something in a medical, healthcare, life science domain, I'm the point of contact or resource for them. Both Karen Suter-Rabler, who I saw maybe still on the line, as well as Sandra Cochran, have also kind of been in a similar role and affiliation as a counselor to the startups that are in the Michigan ecosystem. And within the SBDC, there's a number of other groups, including a growth group, and there's groups that educate on different financial topics, offer webinars, help with export, import rules and regulations, financial planning, just a whole range of things that small businesses might be thinking about. The tech team does tend to work a little bit earlier stage with the companies that the counselors interface with, just by the nature of what are, tech companies, traditional tech companies. There are SBDC counselors who work with restaurants, for example, and other types of small businesses who are definitely playing a really critical role right now with what's unfolding state and nationwide. And as far as MEDC goes, they send in referrals occasionally, and we work through them for the purposes of kind of looking at and securing national SBA funding as well. But I would say, if there are folks on the line today or startups, and I saw a couple of client names pop up, but if there are others who are in the med tech realm and are looking for no cost advisory services or advice and support and consultation, that is what we've kind of been placed here for. And I'm always happy to help have an interaction. I've more and more seen myself as I work through the program as kind of a springboard or an informal, and sometimes formal advisor to the companies. The work that gets done is a lot of listening, a lot of talking and kind of coaching almost, versus being heavy on the delivery line. We will review documents, we'll review grant submissions, and I will counsel people on their regulatory FDA strategy, or their reimbursement plan, for example. But I think an even greater portion of it is softer subjects and counseling around building, growing, and sustaining a small tech business here in the state of Michigan.
What are some of the common things that you bump into? And again, not specifics for specific individuals, but in general, when you run into a MedTech client, what are some of the common things that you find yourself having to listen on and then say, well, okay, I've seen this a few times. Maybe we're going to go in this direction, not that direction. What are some common themes?
Yeah, this varies. This year, there's been a lot of there's been a lot of interest in switching from, and I kind of mentioned this to you, briefly in our recent interactions, but moving quickly from pre-manufacturing, so sort of like a alpha to prototype stage, straight into clinical pilots or trials. And I'm finding myself really coaching and advising both private as well as SBDC clients a lot on, okay, well, there's these certain things for testing that you really should do to ensure that performance is where it needs to be. And there's, consensus standards, for example, on the FDA side that you must meet in order to become approved product. And why would you test in humans in an IRB approved or not IRB approved study or pilot a product before you've been able to successfully complete that testing? Testing obviously doesn't come without, an expense, but I think, and you guys are experts in that more than anyone, but I think that it's, so if anyone from MEDC is on the line today, yes, more funding for those activities for our startup companies. But it is a realization that I've had more and more that particular leap, people are looking for shortcuts too. And it's such an important phase, really, if we're thinking about reimbursement in particular, because reimbursement ideally is sort of dovetailing and aligned in parallel with the regulatory process. The requirements aren't the same. FDA, I think, has been a lot more specific about what it is they want to see to clear, approve, allow for marketing and sale a new medical technology. But the insurance community, CMS, private insurers in the United States, as well as, and I was talking to someone in Canada this morning, but they're not as clear. They are becoming clearer than they were 40 years ago about these are the clinical evidentiary standards that you're going to have to do some studies on, but it is more of a advocacy project, right? That requires grit to get through and get coverage of insurance.
There's a lot of people who just heard you say that and are probably going, wait, you think the FDA is clear on their expectations? And they're going, wait, no, I'm engaged in this, and this is crazy. But you're telling us that, I mean, I think there's generally this realization that reimbursement questions are, to date, they've been less thought about by and large than clearance questions. Now people are waking up to the clearance questions, and they're just starting frequently to ask the reimbursement ones.
Mm-hmm. This is true. There's, for the parallel path review for really high risk or PMA type technology, right, that might have substantial clinical impact or breakthrough clinical impact, the FDA is being a great facilitator of kind of collaborating with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And so we've seen some important things around efficacy and study design that have been done in a collaborative way. But there are definitely a host of class 1, 2, even exempt, FDA exempt products that are not covered by insurance companies. 2020 has been very interesting because even the FDA approval rate with some of the EUAs has been relatively rapid. I say that, but the one I just told you this week, the one ventilator that I was working on for a new ventilator design in March, just the EUA just went in this week. So that's fast, right? But that the reason I'm kind of making that comment is simultaneously insurance has, with COVID test diagnostics, really said, okay, as long as you had the positive COVID test, we're covering that whole stay.
Mm.
And there's a list I actually saw first thing this morning of 13 commercial payers, so not Medicare, Medicaid, but like Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, Priority Health here in the state of Michigan, and some others nationally, but not in every state, that are saying we're waiving copays, deductibles, and coinsurance for COVID-19 into March of 2021. So that's kind of a rapid decision, because this is urgent and emergent versus doing some kind of thorough 2-year study, longitudinal study on whether or not it's cost effective and makes sense to pay for testing and treatment.
And we've certainly seen FDA responding more quickly to things under COVID than they might otherwise. And you're saying the same is true here on the payment side and the insurance side.
Sure.
I want to back up one step too, though, because I know that a lot of times when I say reimbursement and coding to folks, I get a blank stare, and they go, "Oh, what's that?" So for those on the line that don't get it, Lindsay, can you take us back a little bit to some of the big moving parts here of how this works in our country in terms of how pricing is set, how things are decided, who pays for it? Can you give us a 50,000-foot view of some of those moving parts?
Sure. So there is some technology, some therapies and services that are exclusively paid for out of pocket, right? Dentistry is an area where a lot of technology and interventions, just that's optionally what is occurring at a high volume and a high rate. There's, as we know, and is kind of come more into the public view with the Affordable Care Act and things, there are the insured and there are the uninsured, and so different people in different walks of life see payment actually play out in front of them in varying ways. And I think it's always important to kind of come back to that construct, to be thinking about who is this benefiting, because that's what sort of brings us all together and gives us meaning, right? And that being said, in order to get a new technology paid for, you have to have coding, ideally, and then you've got to have the decision that it's going to be covered, that technology or therapy, and then there's got to be reimbursement or payment. And so, and for a lot of folks or clients, I'm often talking with them about a broader picture of healthcare economics and what it means to kind of cultivate a revenue growth strategy with the reimbursement schema in mind. Applying for new coding and coverage is a process, and if some technology, there's existing coding and coverage that can be leveraged for it, or there's different procedural coding and coverage that can be utilized for it. And I think it's important to try and understand and take advantage of existing processes that are out there and can be used. But a lot of what we see, and probably from a development standpoint, are spending more time on with maybe some of the folks on the call, or technologies or therapies or approaches that are new and haven't been tried before. And it was been being reminded the last 2 or 3 weeks with a tech I've been working on in the neuro space, that one of the concepts that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid uses, that private insurers pay attention to as well, as a benefit category. And so figuring out exactly what type of category your product or your MedTech innovation falls into is an important step for them, kind of like, figuring out a product code to go in front of the FDA is an important step to starting a story around how it will be paid for and reimbursed. So, something that might be a rehabilitative device on the FDA side and really does provide a rehabilitative physical therapy purpose, or something on the insurance end in terms of the clinical benefit or outcome it delivers, may need a lot more data than what the FDA is wanting to see with it for. And so really kind of building out a story around what that data is and what it looks like is an exercise that almost all new, just to kind of go back and, you know, generalize it, that almost all new technology have to build out a story around. And I think we are seeing more and more that outcomes matter. Unlike with dialysis 40 or so years ago, or maybe we're getting to 50 years ago, things are not being just covered outright as an entire group of conditions. Some of that in the oncology space, certainly with trials, is happening, but it's getting to a point where you have waived cost sharing arrangements is taking a lot more data and time.
How does that work on the payments side? Because I know on the regulatory side, as you and I both know, FDA, given reviewers will often say, "Oh, we'd really like to see some clinical data," and then it's this sort of back and forth of, well, is it truly required? Is it not required? Can we answer the questions without at least burdensome provisions and all come into play? Who's asking on the payments side? Who is it that's saying we need this clinical data? Who gets to decide what quality of clinical data is necessary? Sounds like it's a dialogue and a back and forth, but who are the players in that kind of a discussion?
It usually, depending on, particularly if your technology, you have to think about who the technology benefits. So if it's children, you're obviously going to have a different audience for payment than if you're dealing with seniors 65 and up, right? And so you want to think about who and what, in addition to that clinical impact. Private insurers do use a range of tech review committees, and they use a range of personnel that are medical experts, right? Similar to when you're having an meaningful interaction or substantive interaction with FDA, they a lot of times will bring in their medical director. The insurance side and the Medicare side also will bring in a medical director for decisions related to coding and coverage. And there are, as you start to submit and dialogue and things, there are timeframes as well that, you know, you can kind of scope out 90 to 180 days for certain types of reviews or responses. I've seen things that have been a lot quicker this year just because the processes are somewhat more informal. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it is case specific. It sounds like anything. And who is the payer? Who are the typical payers here? We've got Center for Medicare and Medicaid setting a lot of stuff, but that doesn't sound like that's the entirety of the picture.
No, and they're they're really operating largely on a national level, although there are these like local contractor types that if you're going after this, you end up wanting to work through. But, you know, there's also a huge portion of private insurers as well that are having a huge impact nationally, and that administer a lot of like the Medigap plans for Medicare, and they have a substantive role. They typically are simply following a CMS decision, but you really, you know, if you get a national coverage determination from Medicare, for example, you're going to be you're going to have kind of something that's nationwide, but there are technologies that do find a path to success that just kind of go locally or insurer to insurer in more of
So
a
the burden may be lower for a local insurer, but if you can stack up enough of those, you're on a path that may be sustainable.
Yeah, I'd have to noodle on if the burden is necessarily lower or less stringent or not. The typical mantra in the insurance world is somewhat like, okay, well, we actually prefer to get a CMS recommendation or decision first, and then we move based on that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I want to say to our audience, if you got questions for Lindsay about reimbursement coding or the offerings of SBDC TechTeam for mentoring for startups, please raise your hand or stick it in the chat or stick it in the questions. I know when you and I were chatting before, Lindsay, you mentioned to me that, I guess somewhat surprisingly, with COVID, it really hasn't changed from your perspective the underlying philosophy of payments per se. How would you give us an encapsulation of what COVID has or hasn't done to this world of payments?
I think there's been a revision. There was a lot of skepticism
Mm,
in the news about whether or not we were getting the counts of COVID positive cases correct. It's still out there. I'm just trying to pretend it's not trending and not follow it. But that's still, that's still definitely an active dialogue in this country and internationally as well. So we've seen changes in terms of payments, in terms of requiring a positive COVID diagnosis before paying for that type of episode of care. And that's in a very direct way, like dealing with it. I think if you look across insurance decisions for coding coverage or reimbursement more broadly, the timelines and the processes followed by insurers, public, private, whatever, haven't changed dramatically this year. There's been sort of this paper versus electronic dichotomy, and I think CMS in particular has been pretty flexible, but reviews and responses have been pretty expeditious, particularly getting into the fourth quarter of this year, from what I've personally, consultatively experienced and witnessed. And I think that's exciting. It's not like there's been an EUA type thing issued for insurance payment, but I'm still seeing, much like, the FDA, where they want the process moving forward. Yeah. Sure.
That's very cool. I want to take you back also to the MEDC and to the SBDC and to what it takes to be eligible. I think it's important because we've been talking today all about all these services. First of all, from Johnson & Johnson, and now from the state of Michigan. And like, there's help out here to get. There's a way to connect. You just got to go do the legwork. And if somebody wants to reach out and they said, okay, I want to go talk to Lindsay through SBDC, how do they do that? What makes them eligible for that?
Yeah, so as long as and eligibility is important. SBDC wants clients to be 50% or more headquartered in the state of Michigan, operational in the state of Michigan. It's always a little frustrating when you see someone, secure capital and then move away from the state, but we have had some that are considered success stories where that obviously has to happen for whatever reason. But the orientation is really around supporting businesses here in the state of Michigan. There are SBDC practices nationwide in many states. Some are more, I think, active, vocal out there with the startup community than others. And I think that it's kind of just redeeming to see so many companies and entrepreneurial founders after they've had one success sort of come back to the SBDC as well. So definitely reach out. Feel free to send me an email. On the SBDC website, there's actually a submission place where Michigan-based companies can get into the client system and request support. It doesn't have to be that you're requesting support from me, although I love to meet new people. There's a whole host of other folks that you can reach out to as well if you think what you're actually looking for is in a different domain area. But if it is really commercialization, MedTech, life science focused, I'm happy to help and engage.
And Lindsay gets involved in all those startup issues and regulatory stuff and reimbursement and coding. And actually, one more quick question on the coding, Lindsay, and this is a maddening question when I get it on the regulatory side, but I don't think people have a clue what they should be thinking about budgeting for reimbursement and coding activities. And I'm sure it depends on the device and the market and everything else. But how does somebody even begin to wrap their head around that?
Yeah, you mean if they get a response about their coding or coverage, or
even to start the process and to execute that process, because like we've said, it's something that people often don't realize. They think they're going to go out and sell, but they don't realize that there's this whole network they have to walk through and in many cases get approvals. Is there any predictability to how to budget for that, or is it just maybe the wisdom is to budget at all for it?
Yeah, I think to budget at all is where we are largely. Even large corporations haven't always fully embraced, even in recent times, kind of having those two paths in parallel working together. So yeah, it is important to budget for. It is important to expect that there's going to be potentially, 2 years or something before you can have enough evidence collected to kind of prove or provide fundamental study data to insurers and or to thought leadership groups that support use of your technology. And I think keeping the cost down or low, a lot of that can be driven by having those thought leaders on board from the beginning. So if you're an individual entrepreneur or you're kind of architecting a solution, having tools in your kit and thought processes around building something out longer term and who you're going to engage. It doesn't, if it's an ENT technology, for example, it doesn't necessarily have to be the head of the National ENT academic research clinical society, but having kind of really mapped out who in the clinical community this may be of interest to is important.
Very cool.
Drive costs down.
Yeah, to drive costs down. Great. Well, Lindsay, is there anything else that you'd like to tell us today? We appreciate your being with us and telling us about SBDC and your activities. And I think I definitely recommend if anybody has a need, reach out to Lindsay, get in touch, and at least discuss your needs. What else should we know today?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's awesome always to meet new people and clients. There's a lot of advisory work that I am doing under my intent umbrella that is outside of the state of Michigan, and more heavy deliverable, operational focused and based. So I'm always happy to help people in those domains as well, or even just have an initial conversation. So if the topic of healthcare reimbursement or new technology reimbursement or regulatory affairs is of interest, or kind of just want to springboard, I'm always happy to have a conversation and sort of decide which apple cart we should be drawing from to be
inside the state or outside the state. No, that's great.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. Lindsay, I appreciate having you here today. If anyone have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I think we asked for that earlier. We didn't see any immediate questions, although we'll give a minute because I may have forgotten to make that request. Feel free to raise your hand. And while we're waiting to 30 seconds for that, I got to hear. So this virtual cycling thing you mentioned earlier, it's a thing, isn't it? I've now seen videos of people doing this. And how does this work? You're on a bike connected to your computer?
Yeah, you're on a bike that's smart and connected to your computer. A lot of people are using this app called Zwift. I don't think Zwift would get FDA approval because there's cartoon cyclists that are crashing into each other, and it seems kind of dangerous. But I like thinking about more structured intervals. Or there's another one that's called Full Gas, where you could be biking in Spain on a Friday late afternoon here in December in Michigan. So it's much more beautiful and visually beneficial than just staring at a basement wall, right? I mean, I like the cold, and I think us all getting outside and getting fresh air is one of the best things that we're going to be able to do over the next few months. So bundle up is my feeling.
Bundle up and get out there. That's really fun. Lindsay Klee, it's good to talk to you today. Thank you as always for all you do in this community, and can't recommend highly enough to get out and talk to Lindsay if you are interested in chatting with her there. Thanks for being with us today, Lindsay.
Thank you, and for all you do too.
And with that, we're past the top of the hour, so we'll be closing it up here really quickly. As always, we do give a chance if anyone has a question in general or an announcement you want to make, this is a chance to grab that and ensconce it. You are free, no matter who you are and what you're talking about, as long as it's part of the general MedTech community. We'd give you a minute now to pop on. I'll look for a hand to be raised if anyone has it. Otherwise, next week, we're talking to Jeff Reinveld from Renaissance Venture Partners. Looking forward to that discussion. And all about the world of investment in MedTech and life sciences. Thanks for being with us today on MedTech Crossroads. Have a great day.